back to episode 5, where we head down to the Gardens Casino to check out the 510 action. As a general note, I'm beginning to find a common theme with LA casinos right now. All of them seem to have stripped away most forms of hourly comps. For this establishment, what I've gathered from the pros is that one of the largest benefits was being in a high-limit room, which had free food and drinks for players playing 510 and up, which is now sadly shut down. I can see how that would be a massive attraction, as LA casinos don't really offer much in the way of other forms of comps. After a short wait, we sit down at a brand new must-move 510 table with unknowns, and we buy in for the 1500 cap. There's a friendly pro talking it up to my left, and he has me slightly distracted while this next hand is dealt out, and I don't hear the dealer announce that there's a live straddle at the time. I look down at ace-jack offsuit, and when I see the under-the-gun toss in 20, it folds around to me, and I raise to 70. The big blind cold calls the 70, and the straddler calls as well. The flop comes ace-5 deuce, and the action checks to me where I continue for a 105. The big blind folds, and actions back to the straddle, who calls. The turn is an offsuit 4, and it checks to me again. I size up to 275 here, and now the straddle decides to shove all in for 650, which was a little confusing at the moment. There's an array of hands she could be doing this with, and it's a bit of a mixed bag of what I'd be ahead of. She was also giving a ton of action at the table, so I decided to call.
I call.
The river pairs the board with a deuce, and the opponent shows ace-jack offsuit for the chop.
Alright.
This next hand is pretty interesting, but not exactly for the usual reasons. I wanted to include it in because there was a little bit of angle shooting going on at the table. If you've never experienced or witnessed this kind of thing firsthand, you actually might have, not realizing it. In my experience, it's much more subtle, and it happens much more than you think. Let's see if you can spot it. We start the hand with the action player who we battled in the first hand, limping in for 10. The player in early position, who I will refer to as Leather Jacket Guy, tries to raise to 25, but instead throws in 17. Which is a clear mistake on his part, as dollar chips don't play. He immediately realizes his mistake and replaces the two $1 chips for two $5 chips, making his bet $25. The mistake looks genuine, and the player says if anyone objects that he would take it back and make it 20 instead. Action now folds to a player in late position as this is occurring, and this player decides to object to the $25 standing. The raiser's bet is adjusted to 20, and now this late position player decides to fold. The button now calls 20, and now the raiser asks why the person objected if he wasn't even going to call, and there's a little bit of laughter at the table. I look down at ace-king in a small blind and raise to 105. The limper, initial raiser, and button all fold, and we take down a small pot. I think this kind of stuff falls in the gray area a lot. In this specific instance, it felt dishonest in the way that the late position player took advantage of this situation. He made it a point to look at his hand and decided to influence the initial player's action based on the strength of his own holdings. While he did fold this time around, I'm not sure if we'd have the same results if he would have looked down at a premium hand. You might argue that this specific situation didn't play out any different outside the pot being somewhat smaller than if the raise stood as is. The button had called a $20 raise, but would the player call a $25 raise on the button? Would I have chosen a different 3-bet sizing on the small blind? We'll actually never know. This next hand has some badly timed aggression along with an odd ending. The under the gun player open limps, and the action folds all the way back to the small blind, who completes for 5, and I check my option. The flop is 5-3-2 with 2 hearts, and action checks to the limper, who bets 25. The small blind folds, and I call the 25. The turn is the ace of diamonds, and when checked to the action player, she bets 45. I decide to raise to 165 for some reason here. In retrospect, this is a pretty poor raise if I'm putting her on ace-high hearts. The opponent calls, and we're off to see the 8 of diamonds on the river. I decide that I'm done with this little adventure, and check it over to her, planning to fold to any bet. In the end, she checks it back, showing the queen 4 of hearts for the straight.
Get in.
For this next hand, I think the table talk is kind of comical, so I decided to keep it in. As a quick note, at this point, there's a really aggressive European pro on my direct left who's been blasting off on random hands. The 20 is on, and I look at pocket queens in early position.
These are no good. Oh, sorry. Oops.
$80.
Give me a second. At least you didn't give me 2.7.
Remember, he said when you raise 300, I must.
Oh, I don't have a $300 raising hand because he might call. $80, huh? I have an $80 hand.
60 more. It's a discount. Punishment. Oh my God.
But I shouldn't have said I didn't have a $300 hand.
All day.
I thought about it after it left my mouth. I said he's gonna raise.
I fold again. A very good hand.
Well, you know I didn't have a $300 hand, so I sure don't have a $400 hand.
No, even before that.
There you go, baby.
There's an early position raise to 35, and the low jack, high jack, and button all call. I look down at deuces in the big blind and call the extra 25. Five ways, we see a flop of queen 10 8 with two clubs. Action checks around surprisingly. The turn brings the deuce of clubs. Action checks around to the late position player who bets 75, and I'm the only caller. The river brings the jack of spades, and when he continues here for 150, I fold since this is just a flush 100% of the time here. This next hand starts recording on the flop action. We're getting dealt some premium hands in less than ideal positions given the motley crew that we have to the left of us. I limp in for 10, and the next act also limps in to a reg pro who raises to 30. Action now folds back to me, and this is a relatively easy raise to 125 to isolate. The limper to my left folds, and the pro calls to 125. The flop is 5 high, and with my range advantage, I continue for 115, and the opponent folds pretty quickly. I'm not sure what it is, but we're just not playing our A game today. But we haven't given up, and we're still in the thick of things battling it out. I don't have the video for this hand, but let's review the notes. This next hand happens pretty quick in succession, and we find ourselves with pocket queens again in the big blind. Under the gun is the aggressive Euro Pro, who opens to 35 and gets 4 callers behind me. This has been a pretty consistent theme, and no one has seen any of my hands for a while at this point, so I think the table is getting tired of my squeezing antics. I raise to 185 here and get no less than 3 callers. The flop of queen 10-4 with 2 hearts is pretty incredible. I continue for 175, and everyone folds. In this next hand, we get into a pretty unfortunate situation. But I do appreciate the action, Mr. Leather Jacket Guy. We have pocket aces under the gun, and to keep with the theme, we limp in here for 10, and action folds to the button who raises to 25. When action folds back to me, I re-raise to 135, and the button calls. The flop comes jack 6-4 with 2 spades, and I lead for 110. After some thinking, the button calls. The turn is a 3 of spades, and with this card I check for pot control, and now the button overbets for 600. In the end, I thought about the types of hands this opponent could have and decided that while that card is definitely better for his range, that it was a little odd that he took such a large sizing here. I had seen him take some pretty odd lines at the table up to this point, so I decided to stick it in here. It turns out that he had 6-5 of spades, so he got there on the turn and took me to value town. After reviewing this hand, I shouldn't need to be the hero in this spot and prefer a fold even if the opponent is pretty unhinged. Later on, we'll see him bow out in the night after getting felted a few more times.
You sure have it. That's I was getting ready.
Immediately after that hand, I'm in the big blind with 7-5 of clubs. There are 2 limpers to the small blind who raises to 50. At this point, I'm totally not in the folding mood and decide to call here and start a cascading chain reaction of calls with the other 2 limpers. The flop is 7-7 deuce with 2 spades. The big blind leads for 125, which is pretty strong from this player as I haven't seen him do anything but play very close to the chest. I immediately raise to 300 and the 2 other players fold. After some thought, the small blind finally shoves all in for around 600 total. The board runs out with the spade flush getting there on the river, but it turns out that it's inconsequential as he has pocket kings. It's getting late in the evening, and I don't know if there's enough time to climb out of this hole. If the game was good, I'd be willing to stay as long as the game didn't break, even down to shorthanded. But this lineup just doesn't qualify. The 5-10 tables are one by one collapsing, and it might be time to pick up soon and come back to fight another day. At this point, I'm thinking about the traffic on the 5 freeway and hoping that it's smooth sailing home when we look down at pocket kings. The under the gun, low jack, and high jack all limp in before I raise the 65 in the cutoff. Mr. Leather Jacket Guy is the player under the gun, and he's been occasionally limping with premium holdings, and this time he seems to have one. He immediately asks the dealer to count down my stack, which is a little awkward as the dealer tells him that she can't do that and that my stack is in plain view for him to see. He actually makes a big deal out of this, and I pay zero attention to this. Visibly flustered now, he raises to 410 and it folds back to me, so I stuff it in for roughly 500 and he calls. The board runs out 7, 7, 7, 5 deuce, and the opponent shows pocket queens. We end up getting a partial refund from earlier, and it feels good. We're going to cover 3 last hands in quick fire manner before wrapping up this episode. There are 2 early position limpers to our favorite robotic online player, who raises to 55. I re-raised to 200 here, looking down at pocket kings, when the button puts in the cold 4-bet to 500. I had nicknamed him the Sleeping Giant in my notes, since he's practically played 2 hands in the last 3 hours. Action folds back to me, and this is kind of a weird situation. He's clearly trying to get this in pre-flop, and while kings is a good hand, this guy's range is either aces, ace-king, or kings. And since I have kings here, it's sort of a weird situation. At one point, I was thinking about folding kings for the first time pre-flop. I get a little too fancy here for my own good and flat his raise, deciding to open shove any non-ace board. So, you know what happens on the flop?
Punishment.
That's right, guys. The flop comes out with an ace on it, and what's worse is that the opponent ends up betting super small here for about a sixth of the pot. This one definitely took a while to figure out, but I ended up folding. Towards the end of the night, the opponent tells me that he had pocket kings as well. Well played, JJ. Enjoy my 500. You definitely earned it. Here's another hand we'll be referring to notes for. At this point, there's an Asian reg that has been at a table for a few hours now, and he's voluntarily upgraded himself to be the drunk table captain. Fun times. Anyhow, in this next hand, our drunk captain is in the $20 straddle, and the robotic opponent opens to 60, and I look down at pocket jacks. Given this situation, I'm planning on putting in the smooth call here just to set the trap. The straddler obliges and puts in that 3-bet to 205. The initial raiser surprisingly calls, and I think we have a pretty straightforward 4-bet shove here for roughly 700. The straddler now tanks and then eventually shoves all in, which is a little worrisome. But once the other opponent folds, he tells me he doesn't know why he shoved. He says he has pocket eights. He requests to run it twice, and we see 2 separate boards. Both boards are ace high, and the opponent proceeds to muck his hand. As we wind down for the night, we pick up King Queen of clubs on the button. There are 3 limpers to me, and I raise to 60. The small blind, big blind, and all the limpers end up calling. 5 ways to a flop, we see Queen 6-3 with 2 diamonds, and when the action checks to me, I continue here for 115. The big blind calls, and now the low jack raises to 400. This is sort of problematic for a few reasons, but in short, this guy gave away the strength of his hand, and we opt to put in the discipline fold. After a rough day in the office, we pack it up and call it quits. We were in for 2,000, out for 1,380 for a loss of 620. Thanks for joining me for another poker vlog. If you made it this far, please don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any future videos. It definitely helps the channel with the YouTube algorithms. Also, I recently published a hand analysis of a 67k pot involving Rampage Poker, which I encourage you to check out if you haven't done so already. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and see you next time.